Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out. We're going to be starting in just a moment. Thanks.
On September 13, 1993, with a historic handshake on the White House South Lawn, Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Chairman Yasser Arafat of the Palestine Liberation Organization embarked on a courageous and tortuous process to end the conflict between their peoples. This handshake embodied the principle that Rabin had campaigned on a year earlier. For Israel to achieve true peace and security, it must embrace compromise. The September 1993 Declaration of Principles and subsequent agreements, known collectively as the Oslo Accords, sought to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict through interim steps toward Palestinian self-determination in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. The start of negotiations and prospects of Israeli-Palestinian peace also reverberated within the American Jewish community. In March of 1993, a meeting between Prime Minister Rabin and a group of Jewish leaders in New York resulted in the birth of Israel Policy Forum, an organization dedicated to fostering American Jewish support for the peace process and providing American Jews with analysis on Israeli-Palestinian affairs. The Oslo process heralded two historic innovations in Israeli-Palestinian relations. The first is mutual recognition. For the first time, Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization recognized each other as legitimate, as partners in reaching a peace agreement. The second innovation is Palestinian self-determination. Israel's cession of Palestinian cities in the West Bank and Gaza to the new Palestinian Authority constituted a momentous step in shrinking the occupation and in allowing Palestinians control over their own affairs. Events of the past 3 decades have tarnished both accomplishments. On November 4, 1995, the assassination of Prime Minister Rabin thrust the country into turmoil. Despite the efforts of the Clinton administration, talks at Camp David in 2000 failed to produce a final status agreement. Deadly Palestinian terror attacks, likely encouraged by Palestinian leadership, left Israeli society traumatized and largely disillusioned about Palestinians' willingness to live alongside them in peace. The unilateral nature of Israeli withdrawals from southern Lebanon in 2000 and Gaza in 2005 created power vacuums filled by terror organizations, leaving Israeli civilians under the threat of rockets and sowing deep skepticism among Israelis about the advisability of ceding territory in general. Israel withdrawing from Gaza without a negotiated agreement, the Hamas takeover of the territory 2 years later, and decades of ineffective and autocratic governance in the West Bank further eroded the Palestinian Authority's mandate to represent the Palestinian people. Rather than offering hope for a better future, the PA has more so begun to symbolize perpetual national disenfranchisement. A rise in support for armed struggle among young Palestinians has reduced how many see the conflict to a zero-sum game in which all Israelis, including civilians, are legitimate targets. In Israel, the past 2 decades have seen the sidelining of the PA and the Palestinian issue, and the proliferation of West Bank settlements in territory Israel was theoretically prepared to hand over to a Palestinian state. Many Israelis have come to believe that Palestinian intransigence and Israel's ability to manage the situation meant that the conflict need not be solved at all. Now, under the most far-right government in its history, Israel is working faster than ever to expand its civilian footprint in the West Bank and erase administrative distinctions between the territory and sovereign Israel, with the goal of preventing a Palestinian state. All of these trends undermine the key achievements of the Oslo era. Nevertheless, neither recognition nor self-determination has yet been erased. Despite its flaws, the PA remains an essential Israeli partner. The majority of Palestinians in the territories live under the Palestinian self-rule established in the 1990s. Meanwhile, the settlement enterprise has not yet secured Israeli dominance over the West Bank or prevented Palestinian contiguity. Oslo's promise may be unfulfilled, but its premise endures. If in the future Israel is to remain secure, Jewish, and democratic, and if one day Palestinians are going to enjoy full self-determination, it will happen through negotiations, measured territorial steps, and tough compromises. It will be achieved by returning to the foundation of recognition and self-determination that the Oslo process established. A two-state outcome remains both feasible and existentially necessary. With no illusions about the formidable challenges the current moment poses to this goal, Israel Policy Forum continues to serve as an essential resource for policymakers and members of the American Jewish community. We've been at the forefront of the American Jewish conversation, warning against dangers like West Bank annexation and the judicial overhaul. Our experts continue to offer incisive policy prescriptions on how to leverage opportunities to advance two states, whether through regional normalization or a more effective U.S. policy towards settlements. Meanwhile, we're developing policy recommendations for the U.S. that aim to bolster Palestinian institutions and state-building initiatives in spite of ineffective and unpopular Palestinian leadership. 30 years since Israel Policy Forum emerged as a voice for American Jews committed to Prime Minister Rabin's vision, we remain steadfast in our conviction that only through an eventual political process with the Palestinians can Zionism achieve its ultimate aspiration, an Israel that is secure, Jewish, and democratic.
Welcome, everyone. Can you hear me okay? I'm Susie Gelman, immediate past chair of Israel Policy Forum. I'm so happy to see all of you here. I know during these days, spending an extra night in Shul is not necessarily something that people particularly welcome, so your being here is especially appreciated. Of course, I want to thank my congregation, Adas Israel, for hosting this. And thank you to our wonderful event partner, the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington, for being a co-host of this event. So, like some of you, Michael and I were on the White House lawn 30 years ago on September 13th, 1993. It was a beautiful sunny day, just like this past September 13th, full of hope and promise. We thought that peace between Israel and Palestinians was on the horizon, that we turned a corner, and of course, the last 30 years happened. So, but we feel it's important to recognize this anniversary, to speak with the folks. The first panel are all people who were involved with the negotiations, to unpack how far we've come and how far we still have to go. And of course, we have what's going on in Israel right now, between attempts at judicial overhaul, efforts every day to basically, if not formally annex the West Bank, do it piece by piece, making it much, much more difficult for there ever to be the two-state solution. And yet, we, at least at Israel Policy Forum, continue to be convinced that the only way that Israel will continue to be a Jewish and democratic and secure state is through an eventual two-state solution that will also enable the Palestinians to recognize their national aspirations. So, and then of course we have the prospect of a Saudi-Israel normalization deal, which may or may not have a meaningful Palestinian component in it. So these are the issues that we're going to attempt to unpack tonight. And I am joined by three unique individuals here on stage. who've each played a vital role in the peace process. I'm going to start with Aaron David Miller, wearing the white kippah, close friend of decades. Aaron is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He served at the State Department as an historian, analyst, negotiator, and advisor in Democratic and Republican administrations, and he was part of the U.S. team that helped to facilitate the Oslo Accords. Joel Singer, to Aaron's left, politically maybe, but I don't know, at least physically, is the former legal advisor to the Israeli Foreign Ministry under the Rabin-Peres government. He negotiated the Israeli-PLO Mutual Recognition Agreement and the Oslo Accords and was on the team for subsequent negotiations on the Arab-Israeli peace process. To my immediate left is Raith Al-Omari. He's a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and a former advisor to the Palestinian peace negotiation team throughout the permanent status negotiations, having participated in various negotiating rounds, including the Camp David Summit and the Taba talks. Full bios, if you're interested, can be found online at ipf.lis/Oslo. So many Israelis, particularly those on the right, blame Oslo for installing a corrupt and terrorist-supporting entity in the West Bank and rewarding violence as a tactic. Many Palestinians blame Oslo for legitimizing and institutionalizing the occupation while placing the burden of perpetuating it onto Palestinian leadership rather than Israel, and giving free rein to the settlement movement to consume the territory of a theoretical future Palestinian state. And yet, for Israel, Oslo created a security infrastructure, an architecture that it did not have before, and reshaped Israel's economy. As for Palestinians, it created a network of Palestinian institutions that did not exist before and could not exist without it, and has brought the Palestinians a measure of autonomy that they did not enjoy before, none of which is a substitute for an independent state. So I want to hear from all of you individually, with the gift of both initial proximity and as well as decades, 3 decades to be precise, of hindsight. What is your assessment of Oslo, and how is its impact felt today? I'm going to start with you, Joel, and just work our way towards me.
It's very difficult to provide a scorecard for a document that I helped shape 30 years ago. So I would probably give just a few highlights of how I see Oslo today. You've already mentioned that some of the good stuff that Oslo helped create, and obviously the people who like to criticize for every good point would come up with 3 bad points. A lot of it is, of course, politically motivated on both sides. I'm more familiar with the criticism on the Israeli side. When I try to distance myself from all of the noise, I do see a few points that are worth mentioning. First of all, the Israeli-Palestinian Mutual Recognition Agreement, which was, in a way, a sidebar issue to the Oslo Accord, something that people may not know, but I came up with this idea when I was asked by Rabin and Peres to join the Oslo negotiations probably 5 months down the road. So I was brought in, and I was given the draft that then existed. And I was told that the idea is that when the document is completed, then the two sides will ask the United States government to present it as its own document to the two sides, and then the PLO will instruct the formal Palestinian delegation in Washington to accept it, and the Israeli government will instruct the formal Israeli delegation to accept it, and the Oslo negotiations will remain secret even after the signing, which I thought was not a good idea, and therefore I suggested that maybe before the Oslo Accord is completed, the two sides, meaning the PLO and Israel, not the formal non-PLO delegation in Washington, should first negotiate a mutual recognition agreement. And everyone opposed this idea. I came up with a proposal, and Shimon Peres objected, Yitzhak Rabin objected, and Yasser Arafat objected even more so. And it took me several months to convince them one after the other, and then reluctantly they agreed to enter into this just 3 days before the famous signing, but for the mutual recognition agreement, you would not have seen Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin shaking hands. It would have been the two formal delegations. Now, why do I see this mutual recognition agreement as something that is even more important than the Oslo Accord, in addition to the fact that I came up with this idea, which is important but not the main point? It was the first time after probably, I'm not counting correctly, but 100 years of Israeli-Palestinian dispute, that the two sides agreed to recognize one another. It wasn't just Israel recognizing the PLO as the sole representative of the Palestinian people. It was actually Israel recognizing the Palestinian people as a people. You have to look at it from a bird's eye view, not just to read the words that I wrote very diplomatically. It was that, as well as the PLO on behalf of the Palestinian people recognizing Israel, not anymore as the Zionist entity, this thing that should be demolished and wiped out because all of Palestine belongs to the Palestinians, and vice versa. So there was something that was very fundamental underlying this mutual recognition agreement. And unlike the Oslo Accords that were limited as an interim agreement for 5 years in order to allow negotiating a permanent status agreement that was never completed, this is eternal. This is forever. This is the first time that two people sharing the same land agreed to recognize one another. So the Oslo Accords, to the extent that it still exists, will be forgotten, but the mutual recognition agreement, I believe, will remain with us forever. And even if it's going to take more than 5 years, more than 30 years, who knows how many years, ultimately, I still believe we're going to see a completion of this process. So I've spoken enough, and maybe others will highlight other good points in the Oslo Accords.
Thank you, Joel. Aaron, next to you.
First of all, it's an honor to be here, Susie, with you. You've done an extraordinary job leading IPF and with Raith and Yoel. Raith's analysis, if you haven't read it, you should read it. It's prescient, it's detached, and it's hopeful. And Yoel Zinger is, I'll say it without hesitation or reservation, is a legend in terms of someone who has played an extraordinary role in drafting and helping to implement a series of negotiations. Some have not succeeded, and Yoel's history goes back to Camp David, the original Camp David. It's an honor to be here with everyone. You know, that day was an extraordinary day. Secretary Christopher said to us, he felt like anything and everything was possible on that day. I felt the same way. And yet 3 decades later, everything, not everything, but much of Oslo lies bloodied, battered, betrayed somewhere. I guess I would definitely agree with Yoel that one of the distinguishing and enduring aspects, for better or for worse, is a recognition on the part of the State of Israel and the PLO, the embodiment of Palestinian nationalism, that any solution to this problem cannot be achieved with Jordan as a primary interlocutor or West Bankers and Gazans. The PLO is now divided. It looks, frankly, like Noah's Ark. There are 2 of everything, 2 constitutions, 2 statelets, 2 sets of security services, 2 patrons, 2 different visions of where Palestine is supposed to be and what it's supposed to be. So it's a fraught problem now, and you have the most right-wing fundamentalists and extreme government in the history of the State of Israel in power now that has no intention of meeting even minimum Palestinian demands. And yet, Benjamin Netanyahu, who said he would never sign anything with the PLO, both in the Hebron Protocols in February of 1997 and at the Wye River Summit in October of '98, met, shook hands, and signed documents with Yasser Arafat. That's one issue that endures. The other is a recentering of the Palestinian cause from the Palestinian diaspora, where propaganda, terrorism, Palestinians as refugees were the distinguishing tropes and strategies and tactics of the Palestinian national movement, a recentering of that national struggle to historic Palestine proper, which left Palestinians, who now control no more than 40% of the West Bank, and that is in varying degrees of control, left with the extraordinary challenge of building the institutions of self-government under an Israeli occupation. I do not believe that there is any precedent in modern history for a people negotiating its way out of an occupation. Usually occupations end, whether it's the French and the Americans in Vietnam, the French in Algeria, the Russians in Afghanistan. They end through armed struggle. I don't think that's the future. But the recentering of the Palestinian issue from the diaspora to the West Bank and Gaza was critically important. And finally, I really do believe that it ushered in real gains in terms of allowing other Arab states, particularly Jordan, to sign a full treaty of peace. There is no way King Hussein could have been, would have been, the second Arab head of state to sign a full treaty of peace with the State of Israel had it not been for the Oslo Accords. Oslo took him off the hook, gave him cover to engage with the Israelis, and even in discussions with Syrians. During those same years, Assad the elder, would remark that Oslo gave him a mandate. As long as the Israelis were prepared to cut a separate deal, gave him a mandate to deal directly, as he did, with Israel. One more comment. Why did Oslo fail? I'll sum it up in 3 words: terror, the expansion of Israeli settlements, and I believe, my views, I'm not trying to sell you anything here, the inability of Arafat as a PLO leader, who made some very, very tough decisions during Oslo. And you all will back me up here. Prime Minister Rabin knew he made tough decisions. But I do not believe Yasser Arafat was capable of making the transition. And Rabin's murder in November of 1995, sealed any transition that Arafat was prepared to make. One last image. One of my last official duties before leaving the State Department was in March of 2002, where then former head of CENTCOM, Anthony Zinni, was given a mission by Colin Powell to go try to negotiate a ceasefire between Yasser Arafat and Arik Sharon, which was, both of us knew was mission impossible. I was assigned to be Zinni's advisor. We saw Arafat in March of 2002 in his Muqata, with the IDF surrounding it, with the windows blacked out, with the doors barricaded, with his conference room where we had met him constant number of times, lit only by candles. And there on the table was Arafat's machine pistol, his black machine pistol. And he basically talked to Zinni and I about redemption of Palestine and martyrdom, in essence, if that was necessary. I'm not singling out Arafat as the only cause of Oslo's demise, much more, but he clearly played a central role. Oslo was the first, in my judgment, Oslo was the first and last concession, and they were big ones that Arafat was prepared to make.
Faith?
All right, thank you very much. And again, just to echo Aaron, it's always a pleasure to be with you, Susie, and to be with IPF. I think it's the second best think tank in Washington after Washington Institute, obviously, and with my friends and colleagues here. But look, I mean, I'm going to try to look at your question from the point of view of a Palestinian policy analyst. Okay, I'm going to try to look at it from terms of what we gained on the Palestinian side, what is lasting, and what are the challenges. Look, I mean, we often, when you hear the Palestinian narrative about Oslo, looking at the failures and where we are right now and how bad things are right now, people will think of things almost like posit this idyllic pre-Oslo Palestinian trajectory and think that Oslo came and ruined what was actually going to an amazing, great place. The reality was very different. Oslo came at a moment where the Palestinian national movement was at a dead end. The Palestinians were already losing relevance. The PLO, by that I mean, was losing relevance regionally, and this really came to a head when when Arafat decided to support Saddam in his occupation of Kuwait. That put the PLO completely on the outs. It was isolated politically, financially, etc. There was no direction. Yes, the Palestinian right to self-determination had long been recognized, yet there was actually no pathway to achieve this self-realization. The first intifada was already petering out and turning on itself, and etc. So we had a moment of serious crisis at that moment, and there was no clearer indication by the fact that the PLO Arafat found himself having to accept that the Palestinian interests were being represented by non-PLO Palestinians from the West Bank in Gaza, and not by the PLO itself. So that was a moment of weakness, and I think Oslo came and put the Palestinian national movement back in center stage. Now, it was not only, a kind of a gimmick or a tactic to get the PLO rehabilitated. I believe there were some strategic gains for the Palestinians there, and I think my colleagues started talking about that. First of all, I believe that Oslo gave the Palestinians a pathway to self-determination. Through creating these ideas, in Oslo we talk about these 5 permanent status issues that we need to negotiate. That was the pathway. And the pathway that ultimately, even though Oslo, if you look at it, does not have the word Palestinian state, the logic that led us to it, a two-state solution, was already baked into Oslo. And it took its time, but ultimately the two-state solution became an international consensus. By the way, interestingly, not only by the kind of, progressive, peace-loving left, but worth remembering that the first American president to accept the two-state solution as a formal policy was George W. Bush, and the first Israeli to accept it was Ariel Sharon. No peacenik by any kind of stretch of the imagination. So I think in that sense, the Palestinian issue and the idea of a two-state solution became international consensus. Now that has implications, diplomatic implications. We talk about the fast pace of settlement expansion. Absolutely. Yet I would argue, absent the idea of a two-state solution, it would have been much faster. Today, I look at the Israeli government, and it's trying to do the creeping annexations and all of that kind of issues. The fact that there's an international consensus on a two-state solution actually is one of the few breaks. You can argue how effective it is, but one of the few breaks towards this downslide. So the idea of self-determination being now not only recognized but operationalized, the idea of the Palestinian Authority, you, I think, both mentioned how the fact that Palestinians are governing themselves on their own territory, yes, partial territory, yes, partial sovereignty, but this was transformational. This was transformational in that it allowed the beginnings of building the nucleus of what in the future would be a Palestinian state. Now, to my mind, these are developments that are still with us. No matter what, we can talk about this part of Oslo not being implemented, that part of Oslo not being implemented. The reality is that there are two things that remain the kind of organizing principle within which the international community and even Palestinian-Israeli relations operate on. Now, that doesn't mean that, of course, that, this is nice for 3 policy analysts, 4 policy analysts sitting here in Washington to talk about. The reality today...
Thank you for giving me a promotion.
It's a demotion, but you're joining with us. Look, it's easy to say this, and I still believe in what I'm saying, yet what is the problem right now is that these kind of premises that the Oslo put into place, these pillars are under tremendous stress right now. And I will end with these 2 thoughts. One is, a two-state solution. Yes, the whole world believes in it. The problem is that the 2 peoples who do not believe in it anymore are the Palestinians and the Israelis. There's a huge lack of faith and trust between the 2 peoples, and without rebuilding this trust, and we can talk about how we can rebuild it later on, but without rebuilding it, we can all support it forever, and then, but it means nothing if the Palestinians and Israelis don't support it. The Palestinian Authority is under tremendous, is in a deep chronic legitimacy crisis. Yes, part of it is certainly the Israelis' fault, whether it's the settlements, etc. But part of it is the PA's own behavior, corruption, mismanagement, closing of the political space, etc., etc. And without rehabilitating the PA in Palestinian eyes, I fear that we might end up with a point where the PA collapses, and with that, I would argue the Palestinian national movement would collapse, because you cannot reconstitute a national movement overnight.
Thank you, all 3 of you, for your opening response. So, as you well remember, the events of 30 years ago were meant to be a beginning. Separation through negotiation into 2 states was assumed, but not formally endorsed by the process. No mention of a Palestinian state, no mention of Jerusalem, nothing about settlement. So basically, Oslo did really not touch on the final status elements that would be necessary to achieving a 2-state solution. The endgame was not defined. Was this an error, or was it in fact a positive? Joel, as an author of Oslo, can I start with you in terms of what was not defined, and did that make a difference at the time, and fast forwarding to today?
The reason that, yeah, of course. The reason that the Oslo Agreement came about is that there were 2 understandings between the 2 delegations in Oslo. One is that we don't talk about the faraway future, only about the next 5 years. And the other one, not less important, we don't talk about the past. Because, just to give you an example, I participated in the negotiations between Israel and Syria as well. And the Syrian position, and Aaron was there, the Syrian position was always, before we talk about this resolution, we must first talk about UN Resolution 242 and reach an agreement about what it means. Once we have agreed about the meaning of 242, which was, as many of you may know, was deliberately left vague, then we can talk about a resolution of our problem, which is it's not a right way to negotiate anything. You have to be pragmatic. The two delegations in Oslo decided to proceed without defining what caused the dispute. And just to illustrate it, I told a joke in Oslo to my esteemed Palestinian colleagues, as well as my Israeli colleagues, about two guys that got into an argument in the street and, shouting and fighting, and a police officer is summoned, and he asked them, how did it all start? So one of them tells the police officer, it all started when he gave me back a slap on the face. This is how it all started. So this is an illustration of what happens when you want to talk about the past before you talk about the future. The other side is, even when you talk about the future, don't try to talk too far away into the future. And this is the unique aspect of the Oslo Agreement as compared to the Israeli-Egyptian Treaty of Peace or the Israeli-Jordanian Treaty of Peace, as well as the Israeli-Lebanese treaty. I was a member of the Israeli delegation that negotiated it as well as the parameters for an Israeli-Syrian agreement. There was always an agreement about the end, and then going back, how do we get to the end being the end result? This is how it's going to look like. How do we get there? In the Israeli-Palestinian agreement, uniquely, it was, this is how we are going to go forward, but we don't know where we are going yet. We haven't decided, which is, again, how can you get there if you haven't decided where you're going? But that was not a unique invention of Oslo. In fact, I will take you back to 1977, when Egyptian President Anwar Sadat made his historic visit to Israel to talk about Israeli-Egyptian relationships, but he also insisted in every speech and every set of negotiations, including the Camp David Accords of 1978, that Egypt would not make a separate peace with Israel. There must also be an agreement between Israel and Egypt about the Israeli-Palestinian relationship. How do we proceed there as well? And the Camp David Accords laid out this idea of 5-year interim agreement, autonomy arrangements, at the end of which, actually starting 3 years down the road, with the intention of completing a permanent status agreement by the end of the 5-year transitional period, in which all the future relationship will be negotiated. Oslo simply copied it, almost verbatim, but not really verbatim, from the Camp David Accords. This was in the letter of invitation to the Madrid conference. Aaron is very familiar with that, and it was carried forward. This is why an agreement was possible in Oslo, because if the two sides went to Oslo with an attempt to negotiate a permanent status agreement, here we are 30 years later, and we are not yet there. So in a way, some people accuse Oslo. Oslo failed because you didn't define the end game. Duh. If there was an attempt to deal with borders, Jerusalem, refugees, sovereignty, and so forth in Oslo, I would have still been there in Oslo, with a Norwegian citizenship and kids that talk Norwegian. So, so this is, it's a mixed bag. It's a good and a bad features of Oslo.
So and I'm going to get to Aaron and Raith in a sec, but in short, Yoel, you feel like Oslo went as far as it could go and still achieve an agreement if it gone any further, if I'm just trying to summarize what you're saying?
Absolutely.
Okay. Aaron.
Yeah, I mean, I think you all, as usual, has identified the core issue. Whether it was good or bad, there would have been no Oslo Accord had the two parties grappled with the issue of borders, security, refugees, and what to do about the overlapping sacred space in Jerusalem. That's clear. You know the old expression, when you don't know where you're going, any road will get you there. But in this sense, I think there was no realistic possibility that there would have been agreement on the broad contours. The problem with Oslo is that the logic of the agreement was that during this interim period, the two parties would engage with one another directly. Security would be enhanced and controlled. There was no reference anywhere in the Oslo Accords to a Palestinian state or a settlements freeze. The Israelis had a remarkably good lawyer on the case. And I think Rabin probably, you all might correct me, may have regretted, particularly in the wake of the Hebron massacre in February of '94, when Baruch Goldstein killed 29 Palestinians in prayer. Rabin may have regretted, in fact, I think confided to us that he did have regrets that he didn't force the issue of withdrawal from Hebron then. The problem with Oslo is that there was no confidence enhancement. There was no mutual trust for any number of reasons for which both sides deserve a huge share of the responsibility. So by the time we went to Camp David in July of 2000 for a historic summit which Bill Clinton, with the best of intentions, believed could at least hammer out a declaration of principles or a set of parameters on the core issues, there was mistrust, there was suspicion, and the summit, frankly, was ill-conceived, ill-advised, and ill-run by the American side. There was no trust, and there was no sense of confidence. And I think that in essence, the logic of Oslo simply was flawed. The counterfactual, of course, is could it have been corrected? Could both sides have implemented their mutual obligations, depositing trust and currency in a bank so that by the time permanent status negotiations began, you might have had some measure of possibility of reaching an agreement. But I'm not sure that was even possible. given the reality of the perverse dance that the occupier and the occupied engaged in during those years. I think it was Ben Franklin or Mark Twain who said proximity breeds contempt and children. And the reality, the reason there's no status quo in the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and it's paradoxical, it's perverse, but I think it's true. The reason there's no status quo is because of the proximity problem. And it is that proximity problem which ensures, at some point, in my view, still, that there will be an opening to move forward. Oslo took things as far as it could.
Great.
Very good. What can I say? I agree. Look, I think it's obvious to me, at least, that if we try to push Oslo towards defining the end game, as you all said, there will be no Oslo and there will be no agreement. Things were just not ready. And if we look at it actually with the kind of what we call the permanent status issues, the end game issues, there are two sets of challenges which were just not ripe during Oslo. One, actually the issues themselves. I mean, we talk, you know, I like to say now, you know, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is one of the most overstudied, overanalyzed conflicts, and we know now all of the permutations of what an end game would look like. That was not the case back in when Oslo was being negotiated. This is a process that happened in the 90s. You know, when we went to in 1999, when we resumed these, when we started these negotiations, we actually already had a lot of second tracks to kind of draw on, and even with that, I think it took us, you know, you talked about Camp David. I believe one of the issues in Camp David, the issues were not ripe yet. We have not given them enough thought. So the issues themselves are very complex. And to try to kind of from scratch resolve issues that are so complicated that until today we're having difficulties with would have been highly, let's say, unrealistic. But the other aspect is political. You know, again, we talk about the mutual recognition kind of as a throwaway statement. I cannot overemphasize what a heavy political lift selling the idea of mutual recognition was at the time. I mean, think of it. Think of it of two nations. I can't speak about for the Israelis. Let me speak about the Palestinians. Decades were spent, you know, we were not even allowed to say the word Israel. Zionist enemy, Zionist entity, etc., the whole thing. And to go to your public overnight and say, actually, I changed my mind and we are mutually recognizing. That required an amount of expenditure of political capital, of political management before and after that thing. To think that then you can load on top of that issues like, you know, the whole, you know, issues of Jerusalem, issues of which are so key to our narrative, like the issues of refugees, etc., and politically get away with it. I think that is highly unrealistic. I think, by the way, and this is where probably I would disagree with you, Aaron, is the issue of Arafat. Arafat, for all of his sins, and there are many, and we can spend hours enumerating them. The one thing I would say for Arafat is that he had a very keen sense of understanding what the traffic would bear in Palestinian politics. He understood what he can get away with and what he cannot get away with, and I think he made that assessment that that was as much as we could get. I believe that if he believed later on that he can sell domestically a permanent status deal, he would have done that, and I believe, you know, you talked about Camp David. One of the issues that we had facing going into Camp David was the fact that we were in such a bad political moment. And I think this is, if there's one thing that I will look back into the whole Oslo process and the whole negotiation process, is we were so cognizant of Israeli politics, and for good reason, but we were completely dismissive of Palestinian politics. But at the moment of Oslo, I don't believe that the moment politically was just ripe on the Palestinian side.
So we are going to, at some point, move to the present day and sort of where do we go from here? But before we do that, I want to ask each of you, looking back 30 years ago, because we do want to recognize this was a major achievement 30 years ago. It really was. And I want to ask each of you, starting with you, Yoel, what part about the Oslo Accords and your role in it and what you were able to achieve at the time do you still feel, first of all, proud of, and what do you feel is sustainable to this day going forward?
Can you repeat
Yeah.
the first part?
I'm asking, looking back 30 years ago, and of course you were very much involved in the negotiations, which were more than 30 years ago. Before we move to the present day and where we are and where do we go from here, looking back, each of you being involved as negotiators at the time, starting with you, Yoel, what do you feel proud of in terms of your involvement in Oslo, and what do you feel is still sustainable 30 years on, given the geopolitics of today?
Well, I talked already about one thing that I'm proud of, which is the mutual recognition agreement. And in a way, it would be easier for me to say what I'm not proud of, because what I think was on the Israeli side the main error, and I think that this is something that Aaron already mentioned it, something that I take partial responsibility for this error, which is in Oslo, the Palestinians wanted to have the Israeli settlement activity being suspended. And I, representing, the Israeli government, or Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres, opposed this. And therefore, the Oslo Agreement did not include a provision suspending Israeli settlement activity, which I thought then, and I think now even more so, was something that is a great error on the Israeli side. I mean, let alone the Palestinian side, but I'm emphasizing the Israeli side because in a way it undercut the possibility of creating a contiguous Palestinian state throughout the West Bank, and I'm not talking now about Gaza. And this is the one thing that I regret more than anything else. Of course, Aaron mentioned also terror activity which undermined the agreement, and I remember Rabin saying during the negotiations in one of the internal meetings, and he said that to me because I was his representative in Oslo. He said, if everything goes wrong with this agreement, but security is maintained, the agreement will succeed. If everything goes right, but the security is not maintained, the agreement will fail. He just told me that when we negotiated the Oslo Agreement. Little did he know how right he was. He didn't predict that this would be, but he did his utmost to maintain security during the autonomy period, and it failed. So Aaron mentioned this, I just repeat this. Other than that, I'm proud of everything else, but for those two features. Oslo was the right way to go. Oslo had a promise. Oslo was, well, it wasn't the ideal way to go, but in the circumstances of that period, it was the only way to go, and it could have succeeded. But now looking back, so I am proud of everything else, but those two things really undercut the prospects of Oslo. So I know you wanted to hear more what I'm proud of, and I emphasize what I'm not proud of. But I'm telling you, I'm proud of everything else. Like Rabin, I'm saying, if security fails, the agreement would fail. If it succeeds, then the agreement will succeed. The words were written perfect about security. I wrote them, so of course they were perfect, but they were not performed, they were not implemented because of the third thing that Aaron just mentioned earlier, because the lack of commitment by Yasser Arafat to really fight against Hamas and the terrorism that Hamas brought in. That was the basic formula under Oslo. If you just look at Oslo and just get rid of all the nice words and the fluff, what was the basic formula? The basic formula was Israeli redeployment, a nice word for withdrawal, and the PLO takes responsibility for security to fight against Palestinian groups that would oppose it. And this basic thing failed. I'm proud of everything else.
One quick follow-up before I get to Aaron. On the settlement issue, would you have been able to sell the Oslo Accords to Rabin and Peres if that had been described differently than the way you're describing it? In other words, not including a clause about cessation of settlement activity or expansions. Would they have signed on to it? Peres, and to you, Yoel, just as a follow-up, real quick.
For me, this security, but for it, there would have been no Oslo. I mean, that was the most...
Because that was a security issue that he was focused on.
I know that, there are many people that accuse Israel that it is too focused on security and neglects other things, but unfortunately, this is the main thing. Without that, there would have been no agreement in the first place, if that was not taken care of in the agreement. And by the way, that was when Rabin took control, quote unquote, of the Oslo negotiations. It started with Yossi Beilin's, talking with the PLO without even Shimon Peres knowing about it. And then he told Shimon Peres, and Shimon Peres told Rabin, and after a while, Rabin said, okay, from now on, I am taking over, and he sent me to Oslo to ensure that the security issues are well taken care of. Rabin wrote the main clause in Oslo about security. So without that, there would have been no agreement. This failed, and the agreement failed. Sorry, I'm repeating myself. But
no, you're not. I just want to...
sine qua non.
I just want our audience to appreciate how extraordinary it is to have Joel Singer, Aaron Miller, and Raith Alomari here talking about Oslo, because they were the architects at the time and very much involved. Aaron, to you about the question I just asked.
Susie, I think the more relevant question for me is not pride or what I'm proud of or what I'm not proud of, is what we learn. What do we learn from the last 30 years? That's the key question. When I left the State Department in 2003, Colin Powell gave me two pieces of advice. One was don't ever try to come back. And the other one was, I took that piece of advice. I had 25 very special years. They can never be repeated. The other piece of advice he gave me, I wholeheartedly rejected, which was don't try to look back. I spent the last 23 years in the public conversation trying to figure out what we did right and what we did wrong. And I'll just make 2 or 3 points. Number one, we disrespected the issues. One of the smartest humans I've ever encountered in my life was Jonathan Schwartz, who worked with us on the negotiations. Jonathan was extraordinary, Yoel's counterpart to a certain degree. And Jonathan kept saying to us, you're disrespecting the issues. Jerusalem, borders, security, refugees, end of conflict. These are not subject to clever U.S. fixes. And we did what we thought was right, but that's number one. Number two, do not believe in irreversibility. nothing in life is, well, few things in life are irreversible. That day, September 13th, 1993, I was persuaded that there was no going back. I remember getting a letter from Ephraim Halevi, who would later become head of Mossad, who questioned my whole premise, and he was right to question it. What Oslo demonstrates is how hard this is, not how easy it is. And number three, domestic politics. I think we have to be absolutely clear that this is not an enterprise for the faint-hearted. It is not an enterprise. It's cost one Israeli prime minister and one Egyptian president their lives. It takes incredible courage and will. And I think Gates is right. I remember at Camp David, Arafat said at least 3 times, and I was not in all of the meetings, "You will not get a chance to walk behind my coffin." Barak and Arafat negotiated the 3 times they met in the same rooms where Sadat and Begin had negotiated. I wondered very often what Arafat was thinking about Sadat and what Ehud Barak, who was quite bold and courageous at Camp David, was thinking with respect to Rabin. And finally, the other point, which I think is the foundation of it all, which is leadership. You need leaders in Washington, in Jerusalem, in Ramallah, who are masters of their political houses, not prisoners of their ideologies. Leaders who are prepared to risk, not because some external force forces them to do this. My favorite expression, in the history of the world, nobody ever washed a rental car. People don't wash rental cars because people care only about what they own. Egypt, Israel happened without the foreknowledge of the United States. Israel, Jordan happened, that relationship predated the creation of the State of Israel. Israel, Syria with the United States, and Israel, Palestinians happened with, we knew about the Oslo Channel, we knew about some of it. They did this on their own. One last point, there are no rewind buttons on history, but I firmly believe if I could change 2 things, the 4 of us would be having a different conversation today. Number 1, Rabin would not have been murdered. And number 2, instead of, and I voted for Republicans and Democrats, and I worked for Republicans and Democrats, but number 2 is Bush 41 and his unbelievably talented Secretary of State would have gone on for another term. Had Rabin lived, had Bush 41 been there, and had Baker remained a Secretary of State, I believe we would have had one agreement either between Israel and Syria or between Israel and the Palestinians. And the whole tenor of the last several decades would have changed. The 1990s was the only decade in the last half of the last century in which there was no major Arab-Israeli war. 48, 56, 67, 82. The 90s came and went without a major Arab-Israeli war. Why? Because the parties were actually willing to test the proposition, and under both the Bush 41 and the Clinton administrations, the U.S. was prepared to a large degree to stand up and believe in this.
Sure. I mean, just to correct one thing you said, I was not an architect of Oslo. I was a 22-year-old fresh graduate from Georgetown.
I'm giving you credit, but you promoted me, so I'm promoting you.
So to say that I actually don't bear any responsibility for the failure. No, but seriously, I mean, look, but I think, look, as I look around the room, and I see so many young people, and by the way, footnote, this is one of the reasons why I love IPF, is the fact that you invest in young people to attend the crowd. So, you know, and this will sound really very alien to all of you here who have come of age really after the 1990s. The one thing I remember very, very distinctly, sitting in my kind of, in my living room watching TV back in Jordan, is the sense of hope, the sense of possibility, the sense that that was the moment where literally a day before, doom and gloom, that day everything was possible. I mean, you talked about, Aaron, how that decade was the decade of no war. I think part of it is the policy aspect of it, but so much of it, the sense that everyone from, me, the 22-year-old, to the world leaders believed that something was possible. This is what we don't have today. And I think a lot of the ugliness we see today is to a large extent borne by this lack of sense. So to me, this is something that, I can convey the facts and to tell you the biggest challenge I face right now, especially when I go to campuses, etc. How do you convey this very alien sense to students and to young people who have never experienced it? It's not something you can describe unless you lived it. So to me, this is really, you talk about that moment. But as I look at the failures, and maybe to just kind of react to what was said, as I looked at, and I fully agree, and I mentioned it earlier, that domestic politics is really, it's key. All politics is local, and certainly in this particular case, it's very local. Unfortunately, I think both leaders, and I think this is where the US was basically almost a spectator, they understood the idea of managing their domestic politics as placating the rejectionists. We saw it being exhibited on the Israeli side by settlement expansion. You don't want to piss off the settlers. We saw it on the Palestinian side in terms of being lax on security, and that allowed terror to happen. I don't think enough effort was done, certainly on the Palestinian side, I would argue on the Israeli side, to actually, manage your politics by expanding and consolidating the constituency that is supportive of that peace and of that direction. So much time and effort has been spent on placating the rejectionists, not enough on supporting and building up the supporters. And I think, by the way, on the Palestinian side, almost an extension of this, and I mentioned it before and I will repeat it, I think the failure to hold the Palestinian Authority responsible in terms of corruption, governance, management, etc. The idea that we're willing to turn a blind eye because, we don't want to rock the boat because we're going to get peace. In the end, we got no peace, and we also got a Palestinian government that the Palestinians themselves cannot be proud of, and therefore we see they are losing faith in that government. What remains and what I believe is still there, I think, as I mentioned earlier, the two basic things, the Palestinian Authority, much as it's flawed, etc., it is a Palestinian achievement, and I think it is fixable, and I think without fixing it, we'll have a Palestinian political vacuum today. I know many young Palestinian people think, oh, the hell with the Palestinian Authority, etc. I would not, the last time we had a collapse of the Palestinian organized national movement was in 1948. It took 2 decades to come up with a new one, and I see the Palestinian issue being in a worse place today. So for my Palestinian interest, I think preserving the PA is key, but also if you want a two-state solution, the PA is the only available address. The other idea that survives with us today is a two-state solution, and I focus on it because I believe there is no other solution. If you accept that this is a conflict between two national movements, two peoples, the Jewish people and the Palestinian people, who both have a just claim to this piece of land, a just claim to self-determination, and two peoples who are not going to abandon their national identity and their sense of self-determination. Anything other than a two-state solution will either be a continuation of the status quo, ugly for everyone, particularly for the Palestinians, or frankly, this whole idea of a one state that presupposes either subjugation of one of the two national movements, which I believe is immoral, or presupposes the elimination of the two national movements, which I believe is not only immoral, but also historic, because people don't just lose faith. So to my mind, these are two things. They are battered, they are sick. The challenge is how do you revive them? But I do believe that these are things that are game changers in the way that we dealt with this conflict.
So we have time for one more lightning round question, because we have another panel. And by the way, I could easily have gone on for another hour plus with the three of you. But the last question has to do with where we are today in terms of Israel-Palestine. We've alluded, obviously, I don't need to go over the challenges with both the current governing coalition in Israel, as well as the problems with the PA that have been referred to here. But and this may seem sort of a naive question given the current realities, but what are the steps that each of you feels in a better world could be taken both by Israel and by the PA to move forward towards an eventual two-state solution? Yoel?
Obviously, it takes two to tango. You cannot talk about what one side can do without thinking about what the other side also should do and how to time a set of steps by each side and how to put into the equation the United States. And it is so complicated where the attention of the world is split into so many other parts of the world that I cannot see in the near or even mid future anything that anyone can do unilaterally or in tandem with others that could dramatically change the stagnation in which the Israeli-Palestinian dispute is now frozen. I don't know whether it's a good time and place to demoralize all of you by sharing with you what I think it would take to restart the peace process, because I am a true believer in progress by catastrophe. And just to give one example, it took the Yom Kippur War to go to the Israeli-Egyptian Treaty of Peace. It took the Intifada to go to Oslo. A second Intifada didn't put the parties back, so you probably need something more catastrophic to do that. But I don't want to spoil your emotions and wishes for a new year, so I would not go into details. But I would want to share with you how I think it's going to look like once we go to a solution. And it's not what I was hoping for in Oslo, but you have to take into consideration the reality. So, you know, you can sit at home and write nice plans and then hope that the words would create the reality, or you could look at the reality and see how to work with it. And unfortunately, and I talked about my greatest regret in Oslo about the settlements, Israeli settlements that are now very difficult to uproot, and who knows how many more settlements and settlers will be there until the time is ripe to talk about a permanent solution. So I'm now beginning to think that an Israeli-Egyptian confederation is the optimal solution, meaning one has to take into account the fact that those two peoples would have to exercise their self-determination in a manner that would not include a Chinese wall between them, where all the Palestinians on one side and all the Jews are on the other side. And the solution must look more like a commingled confederation between two independent and sovereign states that are nonetheless tied in the hip to one another with one capital that includes two capitals inside, one capital of a confederation and two capitals for each of the sovereign state, and some NATO-like security arrangements that would allow them to together fight against, jointly together against common threats from the outside and from the inside. So there is some good news in it, that I still see two independent sovereign state, and one can say that being tied together like a Benelux has some, or like, you know, the European Union with two states tied together. Maybe Jordan will want to join, so we will go back to the original Greater Palestine that included both banks of the Jordan River. But putting Jordan aside for the time being, I believe that the Israeli-Palestinian Confederation is probably the optimal solution that we should begin focusing on. I once wrote an article about this in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, and immediately I was attacked by everyone from the right and from the left in Israel, especially from the left, but also from the right. And I thought to myself, now that I'm reading the criticism against this idea, I'm becoming more convinced that this is probably the only solution. Thank you.
Okay, Aaron Raith, just briefly, because we have to get to the next panel.
I'd only say that I won't play this game anymore. I've spent the last 20 years in the public conversation with one annoyingly consistent message. I told it to John Kerry, I told it to Jared Kushner. I've been singing the same song. You want to have a serious discussion and the possibility of a serious process to create an environment for negotiations that could lead to a conflict-ending solution. And I choose my words very carefully here. A conflict-ending solution. You need four things. Number one, you need leaders. We don't have them. Number two, you need a sense of partnership driven by urgency. And Yoel is absolutely right. Terror and violence. He didn't even mention Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, which was the reason that Bush 41 and Jim Baker were able to put together the Madrid Peace Conference. Urgency is driven by pain and the prospects of gain. We have plenty of pain here, but we don't have the prospects of gain, which brings me to my third missing ingredient, which is effective U.S. mediation. We have not had effective U.S. mediation toward the Arab-Israeli conflict since Bush 41 and James Baker. A sufficient application of a lot of honey to reassure, but also a sufficient application of a lot of vinegar in an effort to create disincentives at key moments in negotiation. Nobody is going to plant a tree in your honor for negotiating an end to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Ask the only three humans who actually succeeded in conflict zone agreements. Forget the Abraham Accords. They are of a different magnitude, order. Henry Kissinger, Jimmy Carter, James Baker. All three of them had very difficult relationships with the state of Israel, Israeli governments, and with the American Jewish community. So you need effective American mediation. And finally, you need an organizing principle. You need something, an end state that both parties can agree on. We do not have these four factors. The prospects of having them anytime soon are remote. And I think it's absolutely elemental. Last point, if Joe Biden called me in and said, I'm ready to launch a major initiative to solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem, I would say, Mr. President, what I didn't say to Bill Clinton before Camp David. Mr. President, you will fail. And because the greatest threat that you face has nothing to do with foreign policy. It's not President Xi, it's not Putin and Ukraine, it's not the Ayatollahs, and it's certainly not an unresolved Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The greatest challenge you face, Mr. President, is what we have here. That is the greatest threat to this republic. The prospects of going after an Israeli-Palestinian conflict-ending solution is ludicrous, and it will result, I'm afraid, in failure. But give me 2 of the 4 things, we can get started.
You know, I theoretically agree with Aaron and Yoel, which is a way of saying I disagree with them, because, you know, yes, catastrophes create openings, and yes, great leaders is what you need. The problem is that until we get to the catastrophe, which I hope we don't get to, but this is the Middle East, we'll get to it at some point, until we get great leaders, and I don't see the political process in Israel or in Palestine being capable of producing these great leaders at the moment, there's a reality. And the reality goes on, despite what we think in Washington. So to my mind, the idea of just waiting for that perfect moment just doesn't rhyme with reality. And so for me, I have a few ideas of where you can go from here. And let me start with the obvious. My previous boss was a medical doctor, so I always start with saying, first, do no harm. I look at the key threats to what is a possibility of a future two-state solution and how we can stop that. To my mind, there are 2 things. There is the unchecked settlement expansion. I do believe we can still have separation today if you look at the map. I am not sure that if we end up with another few years of what this Israeli government is trying to do, that we will end up with that remain possible. So that's 1. 2, as I mentioned before, the Palestinian Authority is a necessity because without an address on the Palestinian people, a political address, you cannot have a two-state solution. So first, do no harm. 2, rehabilitate the idea of cooperation. I fully agree with Aaron today. If you get a negotiation going, it's going to fail. Failure comes with a price. We are paying the price today. Yet, again, you know, my generation, we remember that in the right circumstances, Israelis can do good things for us, and my counterparts in Israel remember the same. Today, people don't see that. The only ones who see it are the security forces, and that's by its very nature invisible. How can we build areas of showing, demonstrating that cooperation, peaceful means actually pay? Because right now, the only way that you can get things done is by using violence, and that's both on both sides. This is not what you want to encourage. So that's 2. 3, and this is where I would actually really disagree with Yoel. As you look at the end game, simplify, don't complicate. This is one thing that I learned early on in my career. The more complex and complicated your plan is, the more likely it is to fail. There are too many more areas of failure. I would say strip it down to its bare minimum. I don't care what the future cultural relations between the 2 peoples are. I don't care what the future economic relations between the 2 people are. That's for the future. What are the core issues? And let's resolve them. And let's go for a divorce, not some sort of weird multi-party marriage. Final point I would put here is that you know, I do see opportunity in the normalization process. We did not get to that, but I think we do have ahead of us. Personally, I'm not a believer that the Saudi-Israeli breakthrough is going to happen soon, but it's going to happen at some point. And I think we have to approach this smartly, realistically, not ask for too much, we will get nothing, but ask for something that's significant enough and see how we can use these processes to incentivize the Palestinians and the Israelis to do no harm and to rebuild some sort of partnership and cooperation.
So unfortunately, we have to end this first panel. I hope you feel as I do that we've been watching a master class in terms of negotiation and just knowledge about the conflict, and really appreciate the 3 of you for what you have done, what you continue to do. So I want to, on behalf of our audience, thank you, Yoel Singer, Aaron David Miller, Raith Al-Omari, and I'll invite you to step off, and Danielle Bella Ellison, who is a member of the Israel Policy Forum Board and a founding member of IPF Atid in DC, is going to introduce the next panel.
Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. Thanks so much, Susie, and distinguished speakers. As mentioned, my name is Danielle Bella-Ellison. I'm an Israel Policy Forum board member and previously served as the founding chair of IPF Atid's DC chapter right here in our capital. I'd like to thank our panelists from the previous panel and the one coming up. For our second discussion this evening, our panelists are of the Oslo and post-Oslo generation. Youth during the process, they were raised first on hope, and then in the shadow of Rabin's assassination, the collapse of the Oslo peace process, and the Second Intifada. With this unique perspective in mind, our panelists will help us unpack this challenging moment and opportunities for the future. Like for our first panel, our moderator is Susie Gelman. Thank you.
Hope you guys aren't sick of me yet, but you will be by the end of the second panel. So I want to introduce our second panel, and we're so honored to have the three of you here. Carmiel Arbit, whose dad has been a longtime friend, is a non-resident senior fellow for Middle East programs and the Scowcroft Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. She's a co-founder of Keybridge Strategies and is the previous director of strategic engagement in AIPAC's Office of Policy and Government Affairs. Shani Reichman in the middle there is the director of IPF Atid, Israel Policy Forum's Young Professionals Network, committed to creating space for nuanced education and engagement about Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. To my left is Khalil Sayed, I hope I said your last name right. Born and raised in Gaza, Khalil is a political analyst and peace activist who is focused on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He's the co-founder of the Agora Initiative, which seeks to advocate constitutional democracy in the Middle East. Full bios, again, can be found online at ipf.li/Oslo. Carmiel, I'm going to start with you. There is a through line between the Netanyahu government's attempts to overhaul Israel's judiciary and the future prospects of a viable negotiated solution to the conflict. Could you please help us unpack the current moment and why it is so consequential?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, first of all, for having me here. That was a tough panel to follow, but we're going to do our best. We're going to do our best, particularly because they're talking about a really hopeful time that was in the past, and you've promised in your program, I noticed, a vision for the future. But we also have to reconcile it to the reality today. Before I start, I do want to thank you, Susie, because I think the work that you have done with IPF is really incredible. And at a moment of true crisis in Israel, a crisis of character, IPF has really been a moral compass for Americans and American Jewry trying to navigate and understand this moment. So thank you, really pleased to be here. Let's unpack a little bit what's happening. And it's been going on now for almost 10 months, so most of you are aware, but let's kind of bring us up to the present moment in time. In December, of course, the most right-wing governing coalition in Israel's history was elected. And within a matter of weeks, it rolled out a judicial reform package that would have included essentially 5 provisions that would have overhauled the judiciary. Only one of those provisions ultimately passed because Israel faced unprecedented protests. Those protests have continued for 9 months, bringing into the streets Israeli citizens who had typically been inactive in the political sphere, whether it was the tech sector, reservists, or others. But ultimately, one provision that would have overhauled essentially Israel's character and the judiciary as we know it has passed. That provision, which known as the reasonableness clause, would have prevented the judicial system from essentially saying whether or not a law or an action undertaken by the government is reasonable. The clause has been used to ensure that major issues like corruption or things that are on their face problematic have not proceeded. This past week, the Supreme Court heard a challenge to the overturning of the unreasonableness clause. This is truly a crisis moment. So that's kind of the moment. That's kind of the things that have happened that have brought us to now. Why is this such a crisis? For about 3 reasons. First of all, Israel has relied on a delicate balance of power between the Knesset and the judiciary. Unlike the United States, there is no Congress, executive, and judicial branch. to ensure or protect Israel's democracy. Second, Israel lacks a constitution. It has relied on its 14 basic laws to ensure that the basic fundamental rights of Israelis are protected and preserved. And third, this crisis now is drawing into question what the future of Israel's character is going to look like, how social cohesion in Israel can be maintained, whether or not Israel can really maintain its Jewish and democratic character. Now, as you mentioned, there's naturally a through line. The Supreme Court has been a critical institution in protecting the rights of minorities, whether it's women, Israeli Arabs, but it has also been a critical venue for Palestinians who are looking to petition the Israeli government against unfettered settlement expansion, violence, and other issues that have transpired in the West Bank. And so the result truly is nothing short of a crisis.
Thank you. Israel's median age is 30, while the median age in the Palestinian territories is 21. In the West Bank, many of the younger generation feel unheard by an unresponsive political class, the old guard. In Israel, young adults have been both driving the growth of the ascendant right wing, and also many of them are leading the protest movement in support of democracy. So Khalil, I'm going to start with you. How can the next generation be constructively engaged and empowered within Israel and the Palestinian territories, but also here in the United States?
Sure, yeah. Thank you for having me, first of all. And I feel really great to be in a panel where everyone else is women. And I think this is a good vision for me to looking forward to see this more happening in the Middle East and Middle East spaces. So when we talk about young people, it's true that the median, as you said, is 21 among the Palestinians. I think of my brother, who is 21 years old, living in Gaza. And I think of him as someone who was born and raised at a time of conflict. He was post-Oslo child who, since he was born in the Second Intifada, lived through the conflict of the Second Intifada, following to the bombing of Gaza, also the mini civil war that we had in Gaza, and after this, the war after war after war. My brother didn't even leave Palestine any time for a visit to Egypt or to Jordan. He never seen his cousins in Jordan, and this is the situation of so many kids of the post-Oslo generation in the Gaza Strip. In the West Bank, although the situation is slightly better, but they're also subject to continuous violence by the Israeli occupation forces, but also by settlers' violence, especially that is increasing at this point. So this is the reality. But on the Palestinian political level too, we have two authoritarian regimes. We are not yet a state, but we have two authoritarian regimes somehow contradictorily. In Gaza, we've got the Islamic regime of Hamas, who's oppressing and leaving no room for any civil society movement or anything of the sort. So is in the West Bank under the Palestinian Authority. And we've seen some movements of trying to protest against the Hamas government in Gaza in the last few months, and we've seen how Hamas oppressed it and repressed it in a really, sadly, I say in a creative way, where they used the counter-protests, etc., and they were really successful at scaring these people from protesting, etc. In the West Bank, similar things happen. In the West Bank, the difference is the younger generation are becoming more and more believers in violent resistance. They are looking at the Oslo Agreement as a failure. They are looking at the expandment of the settlements, and they see that there is no hope. And put yourself in their situation. I mean, I myself was there about a year ago last, and for the first time in a while, I was attacked by the settlers as I'm driving on the highway at like 3 p.m. in front of the soldiers, and the soldiers did nothing. Now, we're used to being attacked by the settlers, but not at 3 p.m. during the day in front of the soldiers, and they're literally just looking at you. So the situation is really hard, and more young people are going through to a violent resistance. You see the Lions Den in Naples, the other movements in Jenin. I think the way to engage young people is through election. We need to invest more in election, to push for an election, and we need to invest more in civil society in the Palestinian territories, push the Palestinian Authority to open more space for these people to express their values and their opinions. And obviously, not to mention the and the first problem and first oppression is from the occupation. So, but we know that this is a much longer conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, shukran. Shani, you're the director of IPF Atid, as mentioned, a community of young professionals aged 21 to 39. And by the way, I just want to say Shani is not just director of IPF Atid, she's a rock star director of IPF Atid. What trends are you seeing when it comes to how young professionals view the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the potential for a path forward?
Yeah, this is on, right?
Yes.
Yes. First of all, I'd like to thank Raif for giving us a shout out, and Susie, because a big piece of IPF Atid's success, which the DC community knows very well, is because Israel Policy Forum leadership gives us a lot of autonomy. It's actually, we're in DC, which is a great place to talk about it because DC is our autonomous region. What Rachel Goldberg says goes. And it's true, though. I think that's partially the key. There are a lot of tropes around young people, young American Jews in particular, not being interested in engaging around Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And while there is certainly truth to that, I won't deny that, we have found in our methodology that when given the space to actively engage in a thoughtful, nuanced, policy-oriented way, when being given the opportunity to sit at the adult table, as our CEO David likes to say, a lot of people are much more interested in engaging. And unfortunately, a lot of folks who I meet were extremely involved in Israel for a long time, certainly grew up involved in movements, and then kind of fell off the map for a bit because of the lack of space to continue engaging in a thoughtful manner. And I'm very grateful that they found us at IPF Atid and at Israel Policy Forum so they could continue to do so. But it's unfortunate that time even existed. So that's a big piece of it. I will make a note in terms of paths forward. Moderates tend to feel very alone. Khalil and I talk a lot about this, how extremists tend to dominate the conversations. We see this in the Israel-Palestine camp, obviously, all the time, but including here. And we certainly see the trend of folks, particularly on the left, moving towards binationalism, under the belief that, as Raif also mentioned, that settlements have expanded beyond the idea, which I do not subscribe to, that settlements have expanded beyond a potential for a future Palestine, and thus embracing binationalism. It's a very troubling trend, certainly for all of us at Israel Policy Forum, definitely for me. But most of the community is quite moderate, is quite centrist. The problem is they don't have a space to be conveying that, and so we try to offer that, and I think we do a pretty excellent job. I know our Tenics in the room would agree. They better, yeah.
Khalil, I'm going to turn back to you with a question I asked the previous panel. As we know, Oslo represented a framework, but not an implementation process, and didn't offer any clarity on final status issues, which we covered in the last discussion. As someone who grew up under the consequences of the Oslo process, what do you see as Oslo's legacy?
It's a good question, and I don't know if it's easy to answer. It's quite difficult because there is complexity there, but I actually was born in 1994, so 1 year after Oslo, and that was the year when Yasser Arafat entered Gaza and when the transfer of power withdrawal, quote-unquote withdrawal, right, from Gaza happened. And you know, as a child, you observe things, and you obviously your mind is limited into the politics and understanding all these things. But I remember going to UNRWA school. I'm a refugee myself, and at the UNRWA school, I remember that we had to sing the Palestinian national anthem. Right? You enter and you sing the anthem, and you see the flag, all of that. And I remember hearing from my uncles and my father that all of them went to jail for raising the flag. That to raise the flag of Palestine, you would go to jail. So this is something that my father, who is, you know, leans toward Fatah or PLO, used to tell us how this is an achievement, this is a good thing, and it's very close. We will go to toward a peace agreement. I remember when President Clinton visited Gaza and the opening of the airport, all these things in my memory. As 5 years old, I went to the airport and so on. We were very proud that the Palestinian people are finally going toward a state. And that's actually well proven in the data that most of the Palestinians supported the Oslo agreement at that time. So it is a positive thing. But beyond this positive, you know, sort of self-autonomy that we had in Gaza, you just walk not really long from there, and you see the army, and you see the checkpoints, and you see the humiliation under the Israeli occupation around the Gaza Strip and in the West Bank. So it's also a legacy of humiliation. It's a legacy of you can't leave your, I mean, my grandparents in Ramallah and I'm in Gaza, but you can't go from Gaza to Ramallah without a permit. So that legacy comes also with Oslo. Today, unfortunately, in the conscious and subconscious of the Palestinians, generally, Oslo is only a humiliation. It's only you look at it and you remember that we're just giving them everything, recognition, etc., and they give us nothing. They give us, well, we recognize the PLO represent you. For us, that means nothing. Still, villages are being burned down, like in Hawara. And what is the Oslo legacy when Hawara is being burned down is that the Palestinian police literally few meters away, but they're not allowed to shoot one bullet to protect the Palestinians. But they're allowed to shoot to protect the settlers by the Oslo Agreement. So that's the complexity of the Oslo Agreement. And I can go on and on of examples of how complicated it is. On the one hand, yes, the flag can be raised, although now in some areas Israel would arrest you for that. On one hand, also there are positive things such as you have a passport, you could travel, it's easier. But on the other hand, there are all sort of humiliation and a continuation of the occupation without any check on it or holding it accountable.
Thank you. Carmiel, back to you. The average Israeli is really not thinking about occupation. Many acknowledge that it's problematic, but there's no urgency to address it in a meaningful way. And in fact, the current government, as we know, is only entrenching the occupation on a daily basis. And yet, over the past several months, I think it's now been 37 weeks, I believe, Motzei Shabbat, it was either 36 or 37 weeks, every Saturday night, hundreds of thousands of Israelis pouring into the streets to fight for a better future when they see democracy is at stake. So does the protest movement offer you any hope in the broader spectrum of resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict?
I think it's a great question and a complex one. You know, it's so interesting to think that the majority of young Israelis have never lived through any serious peace negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians. They have never seen the possibility that we heard here tonight of what a breakthrough looks like, on the one hand. On the other hand, if we had told your generation that there would be normalization agreements between Israel and its neighbors in your lifetime, you would have never believed me. And so we see significant possibilities for change. We also see an incredible stamina on the part of Israelis. You know, when I first saw the protests start, I and the Netanyahu government assumed that it would be time limited, that people would ultimately run out of energy, much in the way that we as Americans did after the Trump election, where you saw massive protests take to the streets, but ultimately people have to go back to their lives and their jobs and their families. And yet somehow that has not been the case in Israel. And I think that really demonstrates that there is a moment here that something fundamental and existential is happening in Israel that is unprecedented. But that energy is largely focused on domestic issues. And the question becomes, how will that translate from the streets to the halls of government and to the larger international questions? It's interesting to note that in October, at the end of October, will be municipal elections. And as we've seen in past protests in Israel, we're starting to see figureheads from the protest movements starting to enter into the political fore. So we had seen this before in the social protest movements, where figures like Stav Shafir came of age and ultimately took the helm of the Labor Party. We're seeing this now at the municipal level start. So people are seeing that their voices can be put to use inside the room, not just outside the room. But we'll have to wait to see how successful they will be and whether that attention will turn from the issues that are more domestic in orientation, like the judicial overhaul, or whether it starts to focus more broadly. But I do think that it is so important to continue to tell the story of Oslo so that people can really think about what is possible even in those darkest moments.
If I can just
Yes,
add.
please. I just
Sorry.
was going to ask a follow-up, and I know, Shrini, you've been to many of the protests in person. The disconnect right now, I want you to maybe focus on this a little bit. Fighting for democracy, but not recognizing that for Israel to be a truly democratic state, there needs to be a Palestinian state alongside of Israel. I mean, there's really no other way for Israel to remain democratic. The alternative would be permanently occupying the West Bank and obviously not enfranchising the Palestinian people, so that would be the antithesis of democracy. So wherever you're going in thinking about following up on Carmiel, I do want you to sort of touch on this disconnect and how that connection can be made, what a full-fledged democracy for Israelis eventually looks like when it comes to resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
It's Mir to Shani.
But no, I mean, Shani, you were going to.
I was going to add on the elections front that the two largest centrist parties in Israel do not have primaries top to bottom of their list, and so I think the question of inclusion of young protesters in the political elite will have a lot to do with if Yair Lapid decides to open up his list and let anybody run. Benny Gantz looks like he's going to be doing that, but I think that's a huge question. Likud manages to galvanize the youth because anybody can run in their elections, and I think that's a big part of that. So I'm hopeful that the protesters will shove the political elite in that direction. And was that question for me? The other one? Or?
Else you wanted to answer it. And Khalil, let me just reframe the question a little bit for you. As someone from Gaza who's watching this protest movement and watching the outpouring on the streets week after week in defense of Israeli democracy, how does it feel to a Palestinian who's watching this and yet not seeing the same effort or even an outcry for making Israel truly democratic by ending the occupation?
Yeah, it's not an easy question either.
I don't ask.
I think the average Palestinian is completely skeptical of the whole thing. The average Palestinian looks at the protest and say, well, that's an internal issue. I mean, we're never part of the issue. They never talk about us. They are just protesting about something about Israeli democracy, because the average Palestinian doesn't even believe that Israel is democracy, because the way they experience Israel is the occupation. They don't experience the civil Israel that the Jews experience in Israel. However, I do give credit to some of the protesters in Israel who are bringing up the occupation issue. There is, I think, I see a lot of signs mentioning kibush in Hebrew, the occupation in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, and that's something that I think Palestinians looking at that would feel more pessimistic, especially Palestinians who still believe in the possibility of peace. I think that's very important that we acknowledge that and we look at it. My hope is that this movement will grow, that the movement that see the intersection between the occupation and the lack of democracy or the attempt to destroy Israeli democracy inside will grow, and that they will realize that in order for Israeli to be some sort of democracy, that the occupation has to end. But for me personally, one of the fascinating things, and actually things that I liked about the Israel democracy protest, that all of a sudden the world cares, and all of a sudden the world can hear some form of criticism of Israel. Because before that, if I had stood and spoke about the occupation, or if I had stood and spoke about the problem with Netanyahu or the settlements, or these extremists are doing for the Palestinians, all of a sudden everyone would be screaming at me anti-Semite or anti-Zionist or whatever. But to me, this is an opportunity that I felt that a lot of Jews in America finally are talking about it, and there is an open conversation to talk about these things, and that's why I feel to an extent more empowered to say the things that they say without feeling that they can be attacked or canceled or whatever. So that's empowering, and that's to me is the most positive things, that more people are talking about it, and that's a good thing.
So for each of you, the following question. Despite living in such close proximity, the fact is that Israelis and Palestinians have very little interaction together. They really largely don't know each other on a people-to-people basis. Most are exposed only to the actions of the other side by the actions and views of extremists on both sides. The visibility of such extremism exacerbated mistrust during and after the Oslo era. So what do each of you feel can be done to build trust between Israelis and Palestinians and foster personal connections between the two sides today, so that both peoples can move past viewing the conflict as a zero-sum game? Carmiel?
Sure. I think your question, you've in some ways begun to answer your earlier question with this question, which is how do we cope with the fact that so many Israelis are focused internally on their democracy and not focusing on a two-state outcome. And I think part of the root of that problem is that so few Israelis and Palestinians are having encounters with one another relative to the previous generation. USIP did a survey recently where something like less than 20% of Israelis and Palestinians had encountered each other through some kind of a structured or organized program, nonetheless to speak of their daily lives. And so starting to promote those types of interactions, whether it's through US-funded programs like the Middle East Partnership Act, whether it's through camps that take place in the United States, or other economic opportunities that include bringing Palestinians into Israel to work, or off-site spaces. I think that's really important because unless you know the other, it's very easy to ignore the other, and that's very much where we are. So I think from a person-to-person level, that's really important. I think second is to really look at, and Raith started to talk about this a little bit in his remarks, what opportunities exist on a global scale to really push this issue. I think that the prospect of US-Saudi normalization, while the timing may be discomforting for many, really thrusts the Palestinian issue back into center stage in a way that it had not been because it is so important to the United States and maybe, as Raith might say, marginally important to the Saudis, that this be a part of the of an ultimate negotiation. And so this is a moment where bringing other geostrategic considerations and geopolitical actors into the space can push the two parties together in a meaningful way.
I'll echo Carmiel's appreciation for MEPA and all of the other amazing people-to-people work, and I'll let Khalil pitch his own or plug his own work in this space, which is very meaningful. And I'll just add that I think the social psychology work being done in this space, if you look up Eran Halperin's social psych lab, or have you seen the Horizon lately, there's very interesting work around encouraging, or rather forcing, Israelis and Palestinians to consider what a future political horizon that is not endless war can look like, and that's a huge piece of bringing the sides closer together. And I am also very optimistic of the potential for the protest to move towards recognizing the role the occupation plays in the lack of democracy from the river to the sea. And I think we've seen that with protesters shouting, where were you in Hawara at the police? And that's not just the anti-occupation tiny segment of the protest. It was widespread. Fortunately for this movement, unfortunately for everyone else, this government has done a wonderful job of connecting the dots between advancing the judicial overhaul and advancing West Bank annexation, right? They've been spending 50% of their time on one, 50% on the other. They've made very clear what their goals are. They've made very clear their agenda. And I think Israelis are struggling to separate the two more and more. And I'm hopeful that this political awakening will be much broader than just around the democracy piece, or the judicial overhaul piece, rather.
Yeah, so the way I approach the question, or my experience or my take on it, comes from two places. The one that for the last 6 or so years of me living in Ramallah, I actually moved from Gaza to Ramallah, I have been trying to do quote-unquote peace activism, grassroots. I want to talk to Israelis. I really want to understand them. I want them to understand us, etc., etc. And I've been many successful and really great initiatives that I worked with, and there were many other failures as well. The other is my sort of political analysis or academic background of how I look at it. I really appreciate the MAPA program. I really appreciate all these attempts to bring Israelis and Palestinians to talk, to humanize each other on the ground. But to be honest, I'm really also very disappointed by the work that has been done there, because it feels like it's only like, let's meet and talk, or eat hummus or whatever, or talk about things that to me it seems silly, and things are not really changing on the ground. There is a huge academic literature on people meeting each other in some sort of equality, working for a common cause, and then they would humanize each other and see each other in a better way, and work toward a better future. But the counter-argument or not the counter-argument, the opposite of that, when you keep meeting each other and you're not equal, and there's no equality, and there is no any potential for you to becoming equal, most likely there is findings that you'll hate each other even more. And I can tell you from personal experience, having to go to meetings or safe spaces or whatever to meet the other side, and knowing how difficult for you it was to get there 3 or 4 hours or whatever, not to mention days waiting for the permit, and for the others to come easily, it's also humiliating, and it also reperpetuates the same oppression and inequality that exists there. And I think that's where the new organization I founded with my friend Elazar, who's an Israeli himself, is trying to look at bringing people together, not just for the sake of talking about peace, but to promote, we argue that to promote constitutional democracy in Israel and Palestine would be the solution, not only for Israel and Palestine, but to make this two areas an example for the rest of the Middle East. So it takes more than just coming together. It takes actual vision and working on it politically for people to become equal and moving forward, seeing a solution.
Thank you. So I have one final question, but before I ask my last question, I'm going to give voice to the question I'm supposed to ask, but I feel like this is a rhetorical question, which is the vast majority of those involved in the peace process, particularly the Oslo Accords, were men. I mean, you made reference to this earlier, Khalil, about the need to have more women in this process, and I'm sure, Carmiel, as a policy analyst, you see the dearth of women in the room with responsibilities similar to yours. So the question I'm supposed to ask, but I'm not sure it's worth asking, is what steps can be taken to ensure that the next generation of women will be meaningfully involved in national security decision-making processes and peacemaking negotiations? And the reason why I think that's a rhetorical question is because we just need to make this happen. I mean, I don't know if you have anything else you want to say about that, other than obviously when you have women in the room, particularly at the higher level, things happen that don't happen when it's just men in the room. Just putting that out there. But Carmiel, if you want to quickly touch on that, and then I'll get to the final question, since
it's
this
better
is your
than
reality.
the work-life balance question, so I'll take it. Yulia Shalomov, who's in the audience, wrote a piece with me for Foreign Policy magazine on the impact of the judicial overhaul on women. And one of the things that we looked at is how female representation in Israel has declined significantly in the new coalition. And frankly, with each election that Israel has had, sparing the last governing coalition where you saw a real surge in female representation, we have seen it slowly decline in Israel, which is pretty remarkable. A reversed trend in contrast to really where the direction the rest of the world is going. So I do think there are significant things that the Israeli government can do, including quotas, including ensuring that there is female representation within parties, whether it's the second seat, as a number of parties in the past coalition did, or simply preventing Israeli parties from blocking female participation. So there are steps that can be taken, but mostly it's the onus of the men in the room who are still in positions of power to ensure that they are opening those doors for women, whether it's on the Palestinian side, the Israeli side, or the American side. What's also notable, even as we've seen women kind of decline in terms of representation, is that this past week, as we saw the Supreme Court take on the judicial overhaul proposal, we also saw women playing just a hugely consequential role in this fight over the judiciary, starting from female protest leaders in the streets to the head of the Supreme Court to the Attorney General. And so you really see how transformational a role women can play when given that opportunity. Shana, you bring
question,
up
but by the way, it's not just directed at Israel, because I think there's also a problem on this side of the ocean in terms of women having meaningful roles in the policy spaces.
I'd love to see a female ambassador to Israel. I don't know where they would find one.
And I have to plug Forum Dvora because I'm the U.S. board chair for them now. They work to advance national women in decision-making spaces and national security in Israel. And I also want to add that for those of us like myself who have opportunities to platform other people, it's very easy to go to the same old people. If I invite Aaron David Miller to speak almost every year, and he's wonderful, and he's a sure thing, and I know it'll be a slam dunk, but sometimes you have to step out of that comfort zone and take a risk and invite someone to speak who's ideally women, younger people, people from minority groups who are underrepresented, to speak, even if you don't know it'll be a sure thing, because that's really the only way to kind of move forward. It requires taking a chance, and it's hard, but it's worthwhile.
Khalil, do you have any thoughts on this?
No, we don't want to hear what he says.
Okay, you're not allowed to speak. Okay, if you want to say something, go ahead.
No, I think on the Palestinian side, I just want to mention that although a lot of progress has been made on women's rights and women empowerment, I mean, education level is much higher, all of that, we still have a lot of work to do in terms of empowering women to be in political power places. And I think that it starts with some form of, again, to election and democratization in Palestine. Unless this really happens, we will keep seeing the same old faces we see always. And something needs to happen in order to not only change politics, but also on women issues. I think democratization is very important in elections.
So my final question for the three of you, and you've been terrific, by the way. One of our board members is Martin Indyk, who's twice U.S. ambassador to Israel, and of course was the last person during the last round of an attempted negotiation in 2014. He was special envoy under President Obama, trying to affect peace between Israelis and Palestinians, or at least move that process forward. And Martin has said he doesn't think that he will see peace between Israelis and Palestinians in his lifetime, but he hopes it will happen during your lifetime. So my question for the three of you, and I'm not giving up hope that it will happen during my lifetime. I'm 68, I've got a lot of years left. But if it doesn't happen during my lifetime, what do each of you feel needs to happen now and in the foreseeable future to preserve the possibility of an eventual two-state solution and an eventual resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, particularly at a time when things are looking rather bleak? Khalil, I'll start with you.
Okay.
Or did you need more time?
Well, no.
Always the easy question.
I mean, the thing is, like, yeah, I mean, I guess I will like contradict everything that Ghaith has said before. In a way, I think that, and in a way, I agree also with other things that have been said. I do believe that there is need to be a catastrophe for things to move forward. Unfortunately, this is the reality, that this is how things move. Not only in the Middle East, because people you like to point out, oh, the Middle East has wars all the time. This is the war. In Latin America, other places, you need some sort of catastrophe for things to move forward and change. From my point of view, the catastrophe that need to happen, and this is a conclusion I came to in the last few months. I always thought that we need better government, improve the PA, make things better, work better, so another round of negotiation would happen, and we'll go toward some peace settlement, whatever. Right now, I believe that to dissolve the PA is the only solution we have. Dissolving the BA, dissolving the security coordination, dissolving what I call cleaning the garbage for Israel, protecting the settlers, protecting our oppressor in the West Bank is the only way to put pressure on Israel. And by this, I don't mean forsaking the two-state solution, because usually people who make this argument say, well, you do this, and you move toward some sort of binationalism or confederation or some other configuration. I say even you could still be committed to two-state solution, but you just end this honestly mockery of situation where there is Area A and the Israelis are not supposed to be there, but today they were in Jenin, yesterday they were in Ramallah, every day they are in Area A. Enough cleaning their garbage, enough not being able to protect our people, just end the Palestinian Authority, and this will allow the Palestinian movement to be rebuilt. This will allow Fatah to reclaim its identity, because the alternative, people are moving more and more toward Hamas, because Hamas is providing an alternative. And as a secular Palestinian myself, I don't want to see Hamas running the show in a few years. If things continue in this trajectory, unfortunately, Hamas and Islamic Jihad will keep gaining more and more traffic, and I don't want this to happen. So that's unfortunately my solution. And I think that if this happens, Israel will have two options. Either you annex completely, or you rethink that you need a new Oslo, but hopefully it will be a better Oslo then.
So I respectfully disagree. No, I think that Khalil's coming from the perspective of what can the Palestinians do. But if I'm going to come from the perspective of what can the U.S. or the Israelis do, I think he will find my alternative is also very nice, which is that I think there's a lot that Israel can do, such as, frankly, not entering Area A regularly, and other other ways that are outlined in, everybody please Google Israel Policy Forum 50 Steps Before the Deal. It's not a joke, you should all do it. That's really the answer to the question. But there's a lot that Israel can do in order to empower the PA in a way that makes them not a subtractor of the occupation. There are ways to empower the PA and make them a legitimate entity and reform them, and it requires a level of willingness that I don't think either side has at the moment, but that doesn't mean they can't. And I will just say that I very much think that there will be some level of peace in my lifetime. I think occupations just simply don't last forever. Situations like this don't last forever. Even if they end up in a very unfortunate war, that war ends too. I'm quite optimistic in that regard, not for any particular reason other than it's just been too long already. It's like the clock's almost running out, I think.
Camille?
This is harder because I'm a little bit older than you guys, but not much. So I do think that in my lifetime, to say that there would not be peace would just be a failure of imagination. So to that end, I do think it's possible. I think from a broad kind of sweeping strokes, not granular what we can do on the ground, confidence building measures, but kind of big picture, I think there's three things that would help move the needle forward. One is that we have to break out of our echo chambers. 75% of Israeli youth identify as right-wing. Continuing to have conversations among the left and with the left and to the left about the left is not going to bring us to a more peaceful outcome in the future. So that would be the first thing that I think we need to do. Second, I think that the American community and the American Jewish community plays a really important role. I think the judicial crisis in Israel is causing many American Jews who had otherwise been supportive of Israel to have a genuine existential crisis. And I'm hearing it among family members, and I'm hearing it among colleagues who study these issues. I think that if the American Jewish community turns away from Israel and turns away from its investment in a Jewish, democratic, peaceful outcome in the region, peace will be impossible. And I think the third thing that is going to be necessary, or maybe it's 2.5, is that the US government has to stay invested. I think as we see normalization move ahead, we've seen important incremental progress that's come as a result of it. So the UAE, for example, demanded that annexation be paused, however temporarily, and that's going to expire imminently. But we see that opportunity coming again through the Saudis, and we will see it move forward. US involvement and investment in this issue is going to be essential and is becoming increasingly difficult as American attention lies elsewhere. And then I think the last thing is the continued work of IPF, both here in the United States, but in Israel, in the Palestinian territories, to educate people, to make sure that they know what has happened and what is possible in the future.
Well, thank you so much to the three of you. I feel like we've been really twice blessed tonight with truly fantastic panels who've given us a lot to think about. I want to thank all of you for coming. As I said, it's not easy to come to Shul in between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, but you did, so thank you for coming. And of course, I want to thank Adas Israel, my synagogue of many, many years, for hosting us, and the Jewish Community Relations Council for being our co-event sponsor. And for those of you who will be fasting, I wish you, if not an easy fast, at least a meaningful fast. So thank you very much to the three of you. You guys give me hope for the future. Thank you. Are you? Yeah, please. I don't have one on me. No, okay. Wonderful. Did you have fun? It was a convenience here. I just wanted
Hi, nice to meet you. Hi, Reagan from J Street. Nice to meet you. Hi, nice to meet you. Megan, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned Yeah, let me give my card.
And actually, Australia aren't It's daunting. I have to think about this in a different way than I normally
My first time like actually good to see you.
Content creator. There you go.
Oh, wait. Exact space that I can think of.
You just took power from that giant hole in the floor? For the projector over there? Oh, I think I saw that's where the cable was. Because usually the house projector lives like right where the stanchions are. That cable, there's power and there's like an XLR patch under there, I think.
provocativeness upon you. Like the dawn, others can make as we grow.
De mañana.
Congregate in strength.
Their answer.
May their memory be a blessing.
Oslo process on stage process established. Determination that the Oslo
that was very
hopeful. Black machine
Not
pistol.
holding
go in accord.
What I'm proud of and what I'm not proud of is what we learn. What do we learn from
it as
hopeful?
a delegation to accept. I think that was very
Black machine pistol, and
And reasonable in our
And introduce.
All its joys and woes. Without